Welcome, Kim. Thank you. Hello. I'm always delighted to be here in Sweden with you all. So, as a excellent, thank you. So, as the introduction mentioned, a few months ago, Johan asked me to talk about design systems because he said, everybody in Sweden loves design systems. And if that's true, you're not alone. One survey recently found that about 69% of enterprise teams either have a design system or they're working on one. Well, I'll tell you, I love design systems too. I think they're often a great investment in simplicity, consistency, efficiency. They make our work a lot easier, a lot better. But here's the question I have for you, maybe an unpopular one. Are design systems the best investment of this much effort? Because a good design system is a product in and of itself. Lots of organizations dedicate entire teams to design systems, because to do it well, you have to do user research, you have to iterate that thing and learn and keep it going, you have to market it, get people using it. That's a lot of time. And as has been said multiple times today, we're really all about increasing our impact in the world. So let me ask this a different way. What has more impact on the user experience in the world? Facebook's design systems or their targeted advertising model that excludes people from job ads and housing ads and affects elections? Pretty clear, I think. What has more impact? Google's material design system or the fact that they're using biased training data so that image recognition thinks people with dark skin are gorillas? I know which problem I'd much rather have the Google team fixing. What has more impact? United Airlines' design system or the fact that they consistently overbook airplanes and then drag their screaming passengers off the plane when that doesn't really work out for them? I'll tell you which I'd rather they fix. I bet most of you would agree with that. Now, design systems are a fine investment, but we have only so much to invest. So, as Mark was saying earlier today, we know that the user interface, which is really what design systems focus on, is just the surface. 90% of the iceberg is under the water. And that's corporate goals. That's how you make money. That's how you hire and train your employees. That's how you incentivize people. It's the training data you use on your algorithms. All of that is really the user experience. And those are design decisions. And they're getting made by people who don't have the training of designers. And you know what? They're always going to be made by people who are not in our team. So let me ask you this. Do you call yourself a user experience designer? Because if all you're doing is the tip of that iceberg, then I think that claim is maybe a little bit grand. If we're really going to work on user experience, we need to look beyond what design systems typically are dealing with. And I would argue that we need to move from design systems that are only about helping designers and developers make better choices to what I'm thinking of as a decision system. How do we help people across all of those parts of the organization make more human-centered choices? Now, I don't think we should go hand a decision system to our colleagues across the company, because they might be a little offended by that. I think we need to develop this with them. But what I'm saying is we need to start thinking about the rest of the user experience as systematically as we do the visual design system. So, what goes into a decision system? Well, I don't entirely know. But as Mark would say, I'm going to show you my shitty first draft. So what do we think needs to go into a decision system? Well, I think Laura just beautifully made the case for my first 2 points here, which is I think we need industry-wide some human-centered values that form the foundation. And we need a set of enforceable ethical standards. We can't leave these up to individual companies to choose, because clearly that doesn't work so well. Within an individual company, I think we then need a set of broadly applicable guiding principles that help teams work towards some shared goals. Because right now, the individual parts of an organization often have different things that they're trying to work toward, and that doesn't really create a coherent experience. And we need diverse teams to make sure that we're developing the right principles and we're delivering them in an effective and inclusive way. Then, within the individual teams, we need to make sure that everybody's got tools and principles and guidance and methods that apply to the work they're doing. And we need different ways to measure the success of that, different from how we use them today. And then I think on top of that, that's where we layer what we think of as a design system today, that component and pattern library. But because the entire universe doesn't actually revolve around what we think of as design, I think there are multiple component libraries. So just as we are able to modularize things like type and buttons and other things, well, imagine if the human resources team had a component library of, say, employee-centered materials that could be deployed in different ways. Imagine if the facilities team had human-centered things. Imagine if the lawyers had human-centered bits of legal text. How about that, right? We can help everybody across the organization make better decisions the same way that we designers and developers make better decisions, right? So let's talk about each of these things one at a time. Human-centered values. I use the term human-centered deliberately rather than user-centered because it's really not just about the person sitting in front of the laptop or the phone anymore. So much of our technology sucks in data from other people, right? If you're not on Facebook, but you know somebody who is, guess what? Facebook has your data anyway. They've created a shadow profile for you. You didn't consent to that, but that's okay, they don't care. They have data about you that they can sell to someone now. The implications of sharing your DNA on some website. Well, your family could, have their data revealed about what health disease, what conditions they might have, and so on, if you're sharing your information. There's a lot of people who aren't actually directly using the tools who are affected by them. So we need to think about humans, not just the ones in front of our tools. But human-centered is one of those kind of problematic words. It's like good design. What the hell does that mean? Sounds good in theory, but what it means to you and what it means to me, that's easy to have different interpretations of. So I do think we need to have some way to evaluate how human-centered are we. I think one interesting starting place is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow argues that our most foundational need as humans is physiological. We need food, shelter, we need food, air, sleep. All those things, the biological organism fails without those, kind of non-negotiable. Beyond that, we need safety and shelter, right? Once those are taken care of, we start to worry about things like love and belonging. Do we have good connections with other people? Do we feel part of a community? Do we feel good about ourselves? And finally, we're working toward what Maslow calls self-actualization, by which he means achieving our full potential as humans. It's an interesting model. If you think about human-centered as supporting this self-actualization, that's an interesting start. Now, some Native American scholars have critiqued Maslow as being too Western, too individualist. They argue that actually the whole point should be community actualization. That if you just focus on self-actualizing individuals, you're going to lose some people. And we can only actualize as communities if we lift everyone up towards self-actualization together. I kind of like this. Not sure it quite fits the Silicon Valley ethos, but I think this is what we ought to be working toward. So my argument is we're not going to self-actualize the entire human race with one product. That's a bit much. But if we say, does my product move some people closer to self-actualization? And does it avoid moving anybody away from self-actualization? Then I think we get to call it human-centered. So to Laura's point, we need to think about who's excluded as well as who's included, and think about what damage we might do, okay? So that's a starting point. Let me show you an example of how we might apply that. Let's say that you build a home automation product. Well, that moves some people closer to self-actualization. If you have a mobility issue, home automation lets you live independently, lets you control your environment, makes you feel better about yourself. That sounds pretty human-centered to me. But we humans are uniquely skilled at being awful to each other. So domestic abuse is a challenge with home automation. People are finding ways to use these to harass people remotely, right? Turning on the lights and making loud noises in the middle of the night, depriving the victims of sleep and control over their environment. This is moving people away from self-actualization. So if you're the product manager on this product and you realize this is happening, human-centered values tell you this should be the very top of your feature backlog, right? That's what I mean by using human-centered values to drive what we do. Now, on top of this, I think we need a set of enforceable ethical standards. Laura just gave you lots of reasons for why that's clear. I think that internet-enabled services and products, I think of them as the largest ever human subjects experiment. We're collecting data on people, we're combining it with data from other sources, we're intervening and trying to change people's behavior. And in most cases, we're doing this entirely without people's consent. Sure sounds like fishy research to me. Now, GDPR is a start. I think in Europe, you're a bit ahead of the rest of the world. But I think we all know GDPR is not really perfect. I don't know how many dialog boxes I've clicked on websites since I got here to Sweden. I don't really feel like I'm somehow better protected, because those just say, if you want to use our website, you got to click here. It's not really quite the idea, is it? But I think we do have a framework that's a pretty good start that we could adopt. It's called the Nuremberg Code. In the trials of Nazi doctors, the world got to see just how much atrocity humans are willing to commit in the name of science. And out of that came the Nuremberg Code. It's a code of ethics that you're familiar with if you've ever done any medical research or any academic human subjects research. Your work was subjected to an independent review board that would ask you a set of pretty hard questions. And it's jet lag. An independent review board is going to ask you a series of questions like, is this of benefit to the individual user or to humanity? Not just to your bottom line, that doesn't count. Is this the only way to achieve this goal? Is the risk to the user proportional to the benefit they receive? So, for example, to use your free airport Wi-Fi, does telling you my mother's maiden name and my date of birth, is that worth just having free Wi-Fi? Yeah, I don't think so. What kinds of harm are possible? You can't not think about this when you're doing human subjects research. And not only do you have to have a list of what those harms are, you have to have a plan to mitigate them, and you have to demonstrate that you have the resources to implement that plan. Otherwise, that review board is going to shut you down. Okay? So, for example, if you're Uber and you're thinking, hey, we should do this cool gamification thing to change driver behavior, that IRB is going to say, well, does that help the drivers in some way? Does that help them make more money, or is that just about your bottom line? What that does is it starts to give you some clear decision-making criteria. Is this really self-interest? As Jeff was saying, are we serving user needs, or are we exploiting user needs? This is a framework to help you make that choice. But perhaps the most important principle in the Nuremberg Code is that of informed consent. Not, we flashed a 20-page list of legalese and had an opt-out checkbox, but do people actually understand what the risks are, and do they agree to them? That consent can't be coerced. It can't be all or nothing. The population can't be vulnerable. Laura showed you a picture of Mattel's smart Barbie that gathers data from children. Children can't give informed consent. Prisoners can't give consent without being coerced. And consent has to be withdrawn at any time. You have to be able to opt out. So let me ask you a question about perhaps your own practices. If anyone here uses a session replay tool, I would like to ask you to stop doing that right now. Session replay is very identifiable. Some of these tools pretend to obscure user identities, but it's really easy to re-identify people. Lots of personal information can get exposed. Security researchers have shown this to be true. But even if that weren't the case, people have no idea that their individual session is being watched, and they would not consent if you ask them for it. You can get all of that information from a usability test with clear consent. So when we say, hey, designers, we're more human-centered than everybody else, are you sure that's true? I don't think we can take that for granted. We have to question our own practices as well. In addition to a code of ethics, within an organization, I think we need a set of principles that are broadly applied across all the teams, and also a set that are specific to our teams. We need them to operate at 2 levels. Those principles have to be things that we can act on. Lots of organizational principles fail because they're so vague. I see in the medical field things like patients first. If I said patients first to you, what would you do differently? What action would you take? I don't know. If instead I said, help patients feel in control, it starts to be easier to imagine what steps you might take to do that. But evidence shows that when you're trying to get an organization to change its behavior, teams do much better at behavior change when the change message comes from their immediate manager or maybe the next level above them, because their manager can help them understand context much better, can help interpret, here's how you apply this in your work. So if putting patients in control is a principle of ours at an organizational level, you want to translate that into more specifics for the individual teams. So for example, if you're the appointments team on the website, you're going to make sure that you're offering appointment choices and letting people specify whether they want to be seen on the weekend or not. If you're the facilities team, you're going to talk about how you set up seating, making sure that patients and doctors are peers. And that's going to inform how they buy and place furniture in the facility, right? It's helping them translate that principle to their context. So that's part of a decision system as well. Now, if we're going to implement those principles well, we need diverse teams to do that, and we need to give them good tools. Now, and I think actually these things are more closely related than we might think. It seems like every week or so I look at the news and somebody launches a product or a feature that's just stupid. Amazon uses an AI to look at all of its most successful employees and then recruit other people like them. But it didn't occur to anybody that they were looking at all the resumes of men. Imagine a machine replicating our own bias if we give it bad training data. Funny that. Google, a while back, launched a well-intended thing that said, hey, we should encourage people to walk more because, you know, we Americans need to do a lot of that. And so what they did was they said, on this walk, you'll burn this many calories, which equates to 2.5 mini cupcakes. Somebody with an eating disorder does not need to see that. It is not helpful. And so this kind of stuff happens, and the company, they could say, wow, we really screwed up, but no. They always say, couldn't have predicted that. Yeah. You could have predicted it if you cared. You could have predicted it if you didn't build features based on somebody's idea, but actually went and did user research. You could have predicted it if imagining possible negative consequences was actually part of your design process. Now, some smart people are starting to work on that latter. Everyone, for example, recently released a set of tools they call consequence scanning, trying to build this into agile processes. And they do have some really interesting prompts, things like, have you thought about privacy and security? Have you thought about this kind of accessibility or inclusion? And it's a good discussion starting point, and I really like the idea of building this in as just a thing that you always do. But I'll tell you the thing that worries me about these tools. In my head, I picture a team full of straight, white, privileged Silicon Valley tech bros saying, we did consequence scanning with ourselves in a room. Aren't we good? I'm sorry, but none of us can imagine the negative consequences that we've never actually seen or heard about. We're just not good at that. I can't actually imagine all the ways in which life can be challenged when you have a disability, right? As a white woman, yeah, there are a lot of ways that racism exists that I never see. Those are invisible to me. So we have to make sure that the people who are imagining negative consequences have actually lived them, because otherwise we're deluding ourselves and we're not really going to improve the situation. So I think that if we're going to have an effective decision system in an organization, we have to have diverse teams. That's got to be part of it. And no team is sufficiently diverse to do without outside input, because even in a very diverse team, let's face it, we're relatively privileged as an industry, we're relatively well educated, there's stuff we're still going to miss. Now, if we have a great diverse team and they have good tools, they still need to know how to learn, right? A good decision system is a learning system. And we learn through stories and through metrics. Stories are an important aspect, I think, of a decision system because they're how we share wisdom. Stories will help us not make the same mistakes that we or other teams have made before. Stories about, here's a decision we made, here's who gained from it, here's what helped, here's what worked well. And stories also need to include, here's a way in which this decision harmed someone, So maybe we shouldn't make a decision like that one again. So stories are a good start, but of course metrics tell us what is the outcome of that decision. I like metrics, I think they're important, but I think across the industry we are using them wrong. Asa Raskin did an interview with the BBC recently that I think illustrated this point. And he was talking about infinite scroll on Facebook, you know, that thing that just keeps you going and going and going. He said, when you put that much pressure on that one number, you're going to start trying to invent new ways of getting people to stay hooked. That word came up just a few minutes ago. And it should scare the crap out of us that we can use the same language that drug dealers use to talk about what we do. I'm not okay with that. I hope you're not either. This is not a thing we should be aiming for. What happens when the metric becomes the goal is that the metric creates a disease. We're over-optimizing for one thing. And if you think about how we use decisions in real life, there's always a limit on what we'll optimize for, right? If I want to optimize my fitness, there's always going to be something that rubs up against, right? Like the time I spend with my family. So I would like to suggest that you never measure just one thing. Always measure two things. One is the goal that you're trying to achieve. Did we actually move that business result? And the other is the value you're not willing to sacrifice to get there. What are you not willing to trade? And if there's nothing we're not willing to trade, that's an interesting piece of data in itself. Facebook, for example, we all know they're focused on engagement, whatever that is, right? So they do lots of things that clearly over-optimize for this metric. I don't think we have to go into that. Everybody's seen the news stories every week. But Mark Zuckerberg says Facebook is about bringing people closer together. It's about making the world more connected. Is that a real value? Well, if it were a real value, we'd be measuring it, right? What if, in addition to engagement, Facebook said, hey, after using Facebook, do you feel closer to people you know? Or do you feel more alienated from other people? Do you have a greater appreciation for people who are not like you? Do you feel more appreciated by people who are not like you? I think if you measured this, it would start to become evident very quickly that some of what Facebook is doing is over-optimizing on engagement, right? So until we measure the things that we say we value, we're always going to overvalue what we measure, and it's going to distort our behavior. It's going to encourage us to make bad decisions. And we don't, as humans, we don't need encouragement to make bad decisions. We're pretty good at that already. So all of this, I think, supports what we think of as a design system, right? Those component libraries, the UI component libraries, HR, legal, everybody else, all those component libraries sit on top of this much deeper, richer, much more complicated system. Now, some of you are sitting here thinking, yeah, she wants me to go build a decision system website tomorrow? No. I'm not suggesting you do that yet, because I know that's sort of an overly ambitious request, right? We can't do this immediately for a few reasons. One is it takes more than us to develop this. Another is that this is big and challenging and requires us to ask some very difficult questions in our organizations. But here's what I am suggesting you do. One, invest at least as much in the bigger decision system as you invest in the design system. And I would argue invest more, because really it's going to have a much bigger impact. And if we're going to claim that rather grand title of user experience designers, we need to be affecting more than just the user interface. Nobody cares how consistent your buttons are. I'm sorry, they don't. They do care what you do with their data. They do care that you treat them well like human beings, that you respect and value. That's much bigger impact than all the design systems in the world. Adopt some explicit ethics. Do not wait for some industry association or government to tell you what they are. Look at the Nuremberg Code and ask yourself, are the things we're doing things that would pass an independent review board? If they're not, you know what to do. Okay? And if you need backup, the Nuremberg Code is a way for you to say, hey, you know, there's this framework we could think about, so it's not just coming from you. And start working on the weakest parts of your decision system. That's part of why I present it to you as a system, right? Because if we're going to make better decisions, we need all of these things in place. Now, I probably missed some. Remember, this is my shitty first draft, so it probably doesn't include some things. And I'd love to hear what you think it's missing. But identify the weak parts. Do you not have a very diverse team? Is that the thing that needs focus? Do you not have clear principles? Maybe that's a thing that needs focus, right? Think about where you're going to get the biggest impact in moving decisions, and start there. Because you know what? Better design at scale, yeah, it's a useful goal. It's not the best goal, right? Nobody is going to read your obituary and say, wow, she designed an amazing design system. Yeah. No, I'd like somebody reading my obituary to see she made the world a better place for more people. That's really what matters in the end, isn't it? Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you so much.
So if someone in the audience needs help to change the design culture tomorrow, where to start?
First, you're not going to change culture tomorrow. It's going to be a multi-year effort. I would also say that changing culture is more complicated, but it's a lot like any other design project, which is start with the problem definition. Really look closely at what you think your culture actually is. And by culture, what I mean is really values. So get to know that very well, and then you can identify what to start working on.
Yes, great.
Also, coaching designers can have much more of an impact than just designing individual products. So what are you most proud of achieving as a design leader?
Well, you sort of just answered the question for me in a way, which is my proudest moment happens every time that somebody says to me, something you taught me helped me do a better job, helped me make a better experience for somebody. That's all I can ask for. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.